15th meeting of the Historical Preservation Board to order. Are the mics on? We'll start with roll call. Colleen?
Board Member Fisher? Board Member Field?
Present.
Board Member Price?
Here.
Chair Grove?
Here.
Board Member Spratlin?
Here.
Board Member Gabriel?
Here.
Board Member Hill?
Here.
Board Member Gullett? Here. Board Member Hood?
Here. And do we want to note that Amy Fisher just walked in?
Noted.
Thank you. And we have two new board members. And the first is alternate 1, and that's Poppy Gullett. And do you want to just, thank you. And our second one is Lisa Hood. She's our alternate 2. And during the training session after our formal meeting, we'll introduce ourselves in a little bit more informal way. But for now, we'll just move forward. The next thing we want to do is a Pledge of Allegiance. Those of you that are here that would like to join us, we will stand up and do that now. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I think I've said that in 30 years.
Thank you.
Did learn something in elementary school.
That's right.
Next, we need approval for the agenda. Do we need a motion for that?
No.
Okay, does anybody have any changes to the agenda? Nothing? Okay. Next item is the minutes to be approved for the January 27th meeting.
February 27th.
February 27th, sorry. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Second?
Seconded.
And tonight, we are not going to use the board, so we have to individually, Colleen, give our vote. So do you want to just run down the list? Okay.
Chair Fisher, Board Member Fisher?
Aye.
Board Member Field?
Aye.
Vice Chair Price?
Aye.
Chair Grove?
Aye.
Board Member Spratlin?
Aye.
Board Member Gabriel?
Aye.
Board Member Hill?
Aye.
The vote is 7 in favor. The motion carries unanimously.
Thank you. Next is public comment, and so Colleen will let us know. And as many of you are well aware, it's the only chance for public comment tonight because we are not having a public hearing.
Oh, shoot. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Okay. So what we'll do is we'll go down the list of those people that would like to speak, and you can go ahead and come to the center of the room, give your name and address, and you have 3 minutes to speak. And if you start getting a yellow card, you have 1 minute yet left, and a red card means that's it.
Yellow card is 30 seconds.
You're 30 seconds. Thank you. Okay, the first person was Frank.
Colleen, can you help me with the opaque projector that is beyond me? Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for having a board. I'm especially appreciative of City Council that has a unique sense of place and identity to our community, which your board is here to protect and to perpetuate. Now, I look at the calendar for the City of Littleton, and I don't know if you find these unique, but here is, can you adjust? Okay, this is the fire drill, not that unique. This is a pond fishing. Most of the city calendar looks like a spiel for parks and recreation. What happened to Littleton's character and uniqueness? Thank you very much. I mean, this is Parks and Recreation. Oh, thank you. And it's disappointing to me to see the Parks and Recreation have a higher priority than Littleton. Now, if we look at the other end of Main Street, we see the clock tower, which gives uniqueness to Littleton. We see the cupola of the courthouse, and we see it all dwarfed by the Grove. Another picture from the bridge. And now we get to this evening's topic, which is the melting pot that has, as I understand it, temporary structures in front of it that totally destroy the uniqueness and character of Littleton. And you lose patience with individuals and city that lets its uniqueness, its charm, its quaintness be compromised by whatever. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Next, Darlie Whitney. Remember to give your name and your address or where you live.
Darlie Whiting, 1508 West Briarwood Avenue. This might be a little confusing to some of you. This is to the Littleton Historic Preservation Board. It's being written by the Historic Littleton, Inc. Board of Directors. We are writing this letter to express concern about the proposal for a permanent structure addition on the east facade of the historic Carnegie Library. For many decades, the city of Littleton has had a conservation easement on the Carnegie Library. The conservation easement grants the city full and free right to the uninterrupted visual enjoyment of the Carnegie Library building. A permanent structure added to the main facade of this building would violate the intent of this easement. The character of many of the buildings along Main Street is protected by the Main Street Historic District. The district has a simple but powerful urban design form, a straight street lined by the historic commercial buildings that frame a view to the west of the historic Carnegie Library with the mountains beyond, and a view to the east with the historic Arapahoe County Courthouse. The Main Street Historic District draws its integrity from these important design elements, with the Carnegie Library and the courthouse forming the bookends of the Main Street. Historic Littleton, Inc. feels that the proposed structure would block the view of the historic Littleton Carnegie Library building from the east. We approve of the protection offered by the City of Littleton's easement on the facade and feel the easement must remain in full force to protect that view. The mission of Historic Littleton, Inc. is to advocate for preservation of our historic buildings. The Carnegie Library is one of the Littleton's most important historic structures, and the integrity of the structure should not be diminished by allowing the construction of a permanent structure on its main east facade. Thank you for the consideration of this matter. Sincerely, the Historic Littleton Board of Directors.
Thank you, Darlie.
Did I make it?
Rebecca Cast.
Now,
When I used to be on council, we had 5 minutes, so that's what I had prepared for. All right, and we also, if someone was here and didn't want to speak, we would let the citizen take their time. Do you do that? Is that? may I
Yeah,
ask-
you have your 3 minutes, and if somebody else wants to take another 3 minutes, that would be fine.
But could I have their 3 minutes? is what
No,
I'm
I
saying?
don't think so, right?
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't understand the rules. Okay,
Give us your name and your address.
well, let me get prepared so I can
Okay.
have all my.
Do you
3
want to come
minutes.
back in a minute? Do you want to go at the
No,
end of the list?
no,
Because we
I'll
have.
just-
Okay, all right.
Just ask for your patience and consideration. Anyway, my name is Rebecca Cast, 1940 West Arapahoe Road in Littleton. Was a former member of the board that you're on, and I'm also a former council member. And I will go as fast as I can tonight. I won't put this on this. We won't go through all that stuff. But this is a little painting. It's sort of looks like an icon. It's actually a painting of the Carnegie Library, which shows the view down Main Street. And to say this is an icon is not exaggerating, because this has been our view down Main Street for over 100 years. Photographs of this Carnegie Library have been in countless of the city calendars, like this was one just a few years ago that showed the frieze. It's been in all of our literature, city literature. This was the first walking tour brochure. It's been in the Historic Littleton brochure. It's an iconic building. If you think how many others are like that in Littleton, maybe Town Hall, maybe the courthouse. It was built in 1916 after citizens and the Littleton Women's Club worked for decades to get a proper library building. And Jean-Jacques Benoit Benedict was the architect. I won't go into anything about him. He's a very interesting person, but we are extremely fortunate to have 3 of his buildings here in Littleton. You can talk to me later if you want to hear more about that, since I'm trying to get through it. Anyway, when he did the library, it's a beautiful Renaissance building with 3 arched windows, an elaborate frieze. It's on the cornice, beautiful wrought iron chandelier. These are all some of his the things that he liked to do with his buildings. And it's the bookend. It became the bookend on the west end of Main Street. The courthouse, which was built a decade earlier, was the bookend on the east end. So we had the Temple of Justice and the Temple of Learning. And this is done deliberately. And so I just feel that this needs to be protected. It's a very important part of this history of Littleton, and we've got conservation easement. Now, I understand the Reed's dilemma, and I really hope the city can work with them to solve this without diminishing without changing the easement, without diminishing this iconic view, which we've had it's been part of our heritage for 100 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. Next, Karen Aras. Am I saying that right? Okay. Sorry. Margie Clute.
I was also deferring my 3 minutes.
Oh, I think we have to do it. Okay. Next one is, if I got this right, I can't read it too well. Is it Paul Hudson? Do I have that right? At 5402 South. Okay. Oh, Pam, I'm sorry. I couldn't read your name for some reason.
I'm Pam Chadbourne. I live a block and a half from here in downtown Littleton. I'd like to ask you to approve the resolution, which I understand denies or recommends to City Council denial of the permanent structures in front of the Carnegie Library. I'm also going to ask you to support the staff in enforcing the conservation easement that exists. It hasn't been enforced up to now. It should be enforced. We need to remove the red tents in front of Carnegie Library. First off, there's an easement right, and it is a right. It is agreed to, and it's known to all parties. I'm going to say I have easements on my property. The water company, the sewer folks, the electrical folks can come on my property at any time. I cannot use that. I must maintain it for their access. We all have easements that we yield to other people, and this is the only conservation right in Littleton. We are entitled to it. I'm going to point out that our predecessors had to work hard to get this stuff built and then get the conservation easement, and you are only stewards for the moment. We have a legacy to pass on, and that should be important to you, Historical Preservation Board. I'm also going to mention the Historic District and Historic Downtown. So Main Street is one way to the west, and there is one building at the end of the road. There's only one building in Littleton that is seen as much. That's the Carnegie Library structure. It's definitive of Littleton. And right now, I don't think it presents a good front for us. I'd like you, again, to restore the view of the Carnegie Library building. Historic districts bring economic value to everyone. They bring it to the district, to the neighborhood, and it would be wrong and destructive to make a decision for a short-term tenant at the expense of the entire business district and the area and the city's legacy. So, Littleton is special, as was mentioned. A lot of cities still have Carnegie Library buildings, but we decided, or our forebears decided 100 years ago, to have a Carnegie Library on one end and a courthouse on the other. Law and learning, the foundation of civilization. This is huge. It is a great legacy for us to have inherited, and I want you to preserve this and restore it. Now, if there's an issue with this business, we have other methods in the city. We have an economic development department who can work with them. We don't want this building to be vacant. We want the businesses there to succeed. But there are other ways to do that than this construction. And you know, businesses come and go, but the library and the city remain, and the people. Please hand on the legacy that we received. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. Next, Rick Cronenberger.
Good evening. I'm Rick Cronenberger at 5796 South Lakeview Street. I would like to take a minute for everybody, a moment of silence for a loss of a World Heritage Site and one of the greatest churches in the world, Notre Dame Cathedral, which happened today. Okay, as a preservationist, lifetime preservationist, it is a very sad thing for me, and I've been in that church a dozen times or so. I'm against the ordinance for installing the tents in front of the Carnegie Library. What I find rather amazing is that in 1983, the city of Littleton, very early in the preservation movement, identified this building as so significant that they were going to purchase an easement, something that was not happening very much in the state of Colorado. Our ordinance was first written in 1978, so this is very early in the preservation of Littleton, and there was no preservation board at the time. As to the bookends aspect of Littleton, what's so unique about our Main Street, it is the bookends. I'm not sure about the law and the learning, but from an urban planning standpoint, Santa Fe Drive came down Rio Grande, turned down Main Street, and went south on Rapp. What that meant was everybody who traveled from Denver to Colorado Springs drove down Main Street looking east. It wasn't by accident that the library was placed there. J.J. Benedict, as a planner and an architect, picked this iconic spot on the bluff of the Platte River. The courthouse had already been built. So he bookended with his City Hall right in the middle. Very iconic buildings. It was by intent to display the library, and we need to restore that facade back. I understand the dilemma with the Reeds. I know that their restaurant business is the one that has been the most successful because of the type of business it is fondue. There are 3 or 4 restaurants that tried to make it in that building before, but just the way the building's laid out, it doesn't work for a restaurant. So I encourage the city to work with them somehow to make their building viable. Their business has brought tens of thousands of people, if not maybe hundreds of thousands of people to downtown Littleton, and we need to kind of support them as much as we can. But first and foremost, we need to be able to see the library. It's critical to the preservation of our Main Street in Littleton. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Is there anybody else that wanted to speak?
I have meant to present this letter that I just read. Do you take that?
Okay, no one else? We did get a couple of emails at the 11th hour from the public. One was from Carol Boulis, and she said, "Dear members of the Historical Preservation Board, please make the decisions necessary to preserve the integrity of the Carnegie Library property by preventing encroachment on the conservation easement and removing the red tents that destroy the view of the historical building. I am heartsick over this destruction of neighborhoods by the Grove and the downtown neighborhoods as huge contemporary homes and apartments tower over the few remaining original homes, i.e. Sycamore Street. The anchor of Main Street should not fall victim to greed as so much of the rest of the city has." There's a couple more that came in. One was from a Miss Jameson, and no, that was already sent. Another one from Ms. Lohman. "To the members of the Historical Preservation Board, congratulations to the new members. As historian, I am hopeful you will find time to do a bit of reading about our town and enforce already existing rules that apply to the historic downtown designation, along with the existing rules about designated landmark buildings. I am fairly certain none of you actually have entered the Carnegie Library that anchors downtown to the west while it was still a library." Probably debatable, but it is possible some of you entered when it was a police station that was there. But most of you only know it as a restaurant that over the years has added unsightly outside dining tents that almost entirely block the view of the building facade that is so important to our town's history. It is important to the history of this country and should be honored as such. If you have not already, please at least reference the city's own history of the building, and she includes a link. The photos in the write-up include an earlier iteration of the restaurant that does not deface the historic building. It is my understanding that the city has every right to require that defacing all-weather tents be removed from the front of the building. It is further my understanding that there is an easement protecting the view of the Carnegie Library building. Historically, Littleton's downtown is anchored on the east by the beautifully restored courthouse and on the west by the Carnegie Library building that is greatly diminished by inappropriate structures that already violate the conservation easement as well as the historical integrity of downtown. Making any type of facade blocking structure permanent would further and violate the concept of downtown corridor and the conservation protected views from downtown. Staff has recommended against a waiver for the permanent structures. The board should go a step further and also require removal of the disfiguring temporary structures. The existing tenant should utilize land out of the view of the shed for either permanent or temporary structures that would not obstruct the facade. That is what the board and city council should require. Please enter these comments into the record and feel free to contact me as you wish, and I will forward these to you. So we had no more public comments.
I have a quick question, pardon the interruption.
Oh, yes.
I'd just like to confirm that the applicant would have time to speak after staff's presentation regarding the Carnegie Library easement issue.
That's part of a...
During the general business item.
Yeah.
Perfect, thank you, I just wanted to
But we're
confirm
not having a public meeting, right?
Right, it's not a public hearing, but the applicant would still have time
Okay.
to discuss during general business.
Okay,
Thank you.
Sounds
Perfect.
good. All right, so no more public comments. Now we move on to electing a temporary chair in anticipation of electing a chair and vice chair for the Historical Preservation Board. So we're going to go ahead and tell me if this is the appropriate process of electing Colleen, who is the Deputy City Clerk, as temporary chair.
You would actually need to make a motion and have a second. It would have to be approved by the board.
Can somebody go ahead and make a motion to elect Colleen as temporary chair while we conduct elections?
So moved.
Second.
Seconded.
Okay, and we need to do a roll call. All in favor?
Aye. Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Congratulations.
I'm going to, just like Pam when she came in and said she was chair for 3.5 minutes, that's about how long I'm going to be chair.
Well, it's more
so.
like a half hour, but.
Okay. Pursuant to our municipal code, Title II, Chapter 2, each board and commission shall elect its own chairman and vice chair from citizens at-large members at its first meeting in April of each year or at any other such time designated by bylaws. Since this is our first meeting in April, I am going to accept nominations for the role of chair. At this time, it is not a motion, just nominations. So if anyone would like to nominate either yourself or one of your other worthy board members for chair, I would entertain those nominations now.
I would like to nominate Michael Price for chair.
Are there any other nominations? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion to elect Board Member Price as chair.
I move to elect Board Member Price as chair of the Historical Preservation Board.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. And I'll go ahead and do a roll call vote.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
You can vote for yourself, it's okay.
Aye.
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 Congratulations,
Thank you.
Chair Price.
I didn't even have to do a nominating speech.
You didn't even have to nominate yourself or anything. Okay.
Well, thank you.
Along those same lines, we will now look, you,
I got the gavel now.
she couldn't get rid of it quick enough, could she?
Everybody behave now. Okay.
Now, to fill the now vacant vice chair position, I will entertain nominations for vice chair.
I'd like to nominate Kim Field.
Seconded.
Well, right now we're just doing nominations. Are there any other nominations? Okay, I would entertain a motion.
I'll move to nominate Kim Fields as vice chair.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Oh, okay, I'll give that to Board Member Gabriel. Okay, I'll go ahead and do a roll call vote.
Aye.
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 Congratulations, Vice Chair. At this time, I will adjourn the transitional meeting of the Historic Preservation Board and turn the meeting back over to Chair Price.
Thank you, Colleen. Under general business, we have HPB Resolution 02-2019, which is a resolution of the Historical Preservation Board of the City of Littleton, Colorado, concerning an amendment to a conservation easement that encumbers the property at 2707 West Main Street. So we'll start with staff report.
Thank you. And I'll get started as soon as you can tell me that you see the screen in front of you. We have a presentation that'll go along with this.
Okay.
All right. So thanks for taking the time to meet. My name is Rob Haig. I'm a planner with the City of Littleton. I'll be representing staff today. As you mentioned, this is the Carnegie Library Conservation Easement Amendment. The requested board action tonight is the recommendation for approval of the amendment to the conservation easement on the Carnegie Library property at 2707 West Main Street. There's an existing conservation easement in Gross that grants the city uninterrupted visual enjoyment of the Carnegie Library building, its facade, and the improvements that existed at the time when the easement was agreed upon in 1983. There are several exhibits that go along with that easement that describe the existing facade and improvements at that time. And the proposed amendment would create an exception to that easement that would allow for the construction of 4-season pergolas on the east side of the Carnegie Library building. So just to go over kind of what the presentation is going to look like tonight, we're going to go over the process, where we are in the process, the application details, the review criteria, and staff's analysis, and staff will offer our recommendation, and then the Historic Preservation Board can take action. So in February of this year, staff determined that the existing tents, the red tents on site, were in violation of the existing conservation easement and needed to be removed. The option given to the applicant was, in lieu of removing the tents immediately, they could apply and submit this application to amend that easement. This is the application before you, and that's the route the applicant went to take forward. So following this, the proceedings here, depending on what happens with this amendment, the tents will either need to be removed and replaced with pergolas or removed. So staff reviewed the amendment and is recommending denial. So staff's denial would be an approval of the Resolution 02-2019, the HPB. So now we are at the Historical Preservation Board review. You will make a recommendation to City Council. City Council will ultimately make the decision on whether or not to amend the existing conservation easement. And if approved, there would be site development plans, sketch plans, and Historic Preservation Board approval of the pergolas to make sure that any other zoning requirements can be met. If there are design standards that would apply to this property for the downtown design standards, that all those would need to be met as well. This approval wouldn't grant any of that approval. It would just kind of allow for that process to continue. So a little bit about the application and the property. So the Carnegie Library Building, as has been stated, is at the west end of the downtown Main Street district. So Main Street is a westbound street, faces directly towards the Carnegie Library Building. The area highlighted in blue here is where the pergolas would potentially be permitted. And this is, as has been stated, is a major focal point if you are downtown, whether as a pedestrian or in a vehicle. It's existed downtown since 1916, 1917, and is an iconic structure. It does make appearances in lots of different city documents, and has had significant impacts on its cultural impacts as well as the just the importance of the structure. So again, the structure was completed and opened as a library in 1917. It has been modified over time. There are significant additions to the south and west side of the structure, as well as there's also an addition to the north side of the structure. This eastern facade is largely unaltered over time and still retains most of its integrity. The city does own this full and free right to uninterrupted visual enjoyment of the facade. The existing tents, as well as the proposed pergolas, would interrupt that visual enjoyment, and therefore that's why the amendment needs to be modified in order for any pergola or permanent structure to be located here. So these are just some views over time from 1920, shortly after the library was constructed, and now in 2018 with the existing temporary tents out front of the building. So staff is recommending denial of the amendment. The amendment, staff feels, undermines the intent of the original conservation easement, which was put in place to protect the views of this library building in perpetuity. Staff also finds that it is not in the best interest of the City of Littleton, its citizens, or its visitors because of this, this impact and this loss of protection to this historic structure. Staff also finds that this would be detrimental to the historic character of downtown Littleton, not only because the structure itself is historic and significant, but because of how this structure contributes to the overall character of historic downtown Littleton. So that concludes our staff presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions or go back to any slides. This slide in front of you kind of lays out the different options that you have. And again, I'd be happy to answer any questions or return to any previous slides.
Questions?
I do have a question. How long were the tents up before the city noticed? How long have they been in existence in front of the building?
So we're not exactly sure. We looked back at some of the Google images to see, when they started to appear, and it was the early 2010s, so maybe 8 to 10 years. The applicant is also here to speak and answer questions. They might be able to more accurately answer how long the tents have actually been there. I can't say it's before my time when the city noticed them and started to have concerns with them. However, now with this recent determination, staff has determined that these tents are in violation of the easement and do need to be removed and not replaced in the following season.
Did we decide that applicant has a chance to speak? Okay. Any other questions for Rob?
Yes. If you'll indulge me for one moment,
Of course.
Could you repeat what you said about the intent of the easement that was established in 1983?
So these easements exist with the property, they run with the land regardless of changes in ownership. And they exist in perpetuity unless they are otherwise changed. I guess it was some degree of assumption on staff's, at the staff level, but we, based on the language in the easement, assumed the intent of this easement was to protect the view and grant the city and its citizens the uninterrupted visual enjoyment of this facade. And we feel that this easement, by reducing the effect of that easement and that original force of the easement, does negatively impact what staff assumes was the original intent when the easement was established.
So the easement was established in 1983 to protect the view in perpetuity, is that right?
That's correct.
And is that still important to the city of Littleton?
Staff believes it is, or should be, and that's part of the decision that we're here to make tonight.
All right, thank you.
Rob, was that done in conjunction with selling the Carnegie Library to a private property owner?
It doesn't appear that the dates of sale and the dates of the easement being established line up perfectly. It does appear that the property was privately owned for some time before the easement was established, just a number of years.
Thank you.
Rob, if the amendment is approved, will COA be required?
Let's see, I believe a COA would be required, and I'm recalling my conversations with Andrea, who couldn't be here today. I believe a COA would be required and would be reviewed against the downtown design standards, not the historic preservation standards. That probably makes more sense to you than it does to me, but the standards, it would be a different type of review because it's not an addition to the actual library building, but because it's an accessory structure that's in front of or on the property is a part of the district, that there would be a COA review.
Okay, thank you.
Could you put up the slide again that shows the current the facade of the library?
Is this the correct slide?
Yeah, so my question is, on this easement, it talks about in the background, there are no exact dimensions on the conservation easement. So if that's the case, wouldn't the tree that's in front of the library then be against the easement?
It could. We've talked about this at the staff level. So, the easement does talk about the existing, what existed on the property in 1983 and does have a site plan. Site plan does show some vegetation on the site, also shows some umbrellas, not tents, but umbrellas on the site that staff feels like could be grounds to keep these trees. However, the tree does interrupt the full or it could be interpreted to be conflicting with the easement, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Well, I just, I want to know if this is appropriate to share a quick conversation I had with a Littleton resident at one of the meet and greets, or no, I think it was at Western Welcome Week when Historic Preservation Board shared a booth with Historic Littleton. Could I share that very, very quickly? Is that okay?
I think so, okay.
If you've had conversations outside of the meeting, I think it's appropriate to share them. so that everybody on the board has the same
So it's
information
appropriate.
that you do.
Okay, it was just a real quick one. I believe that Historic Littleton has some line drawings that were on note cards or just an illustration of the Carnegie Library, and it did not have the tents in front of it at that time. And there were a couple of folks that were looking at them and wondering, wow, where is this incredible building? Where is that? And I said, that's the Carnegie Library at the end of Main Street where the melting pot is. And these people were amazed. They were like, oh, I didn't recognize that. I've never seen that before. That's beautiful. And my point is that we have this incredible structure that is the Carnegie Library, and it's not recognizable as such to the folks that drive past it and walk past it in the city every day.
Thanks, Kim. Any other questions or comments? And shall we hear from the applicant? Is the applicant here? Come on down. Please state your name and your address.
My name is Kyle Reed, and this is my wife, Amy. Lived here in Littleton. We recently moved down to Highlands Ranch, 854 Country Briar Lane.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and wanted to first say I'm the owner, I'm the operator of the restaurant, and I certainly understand everyone's concerns, and I do appreciate you letting us speak tonight. My wife, Amy, was on the historical board, and I think maybe I'll just say a couple of words, and then I'll let her answer your questions. Everything that I've heard tonight about the concerns, I certainly understand. We don't really like the tents either. What we are looking at is this is more of from a business view and for looking for a compromise. We have been in the building for almost 25 years. We came to Littleton and the building was released. We were not the ones that made it a commercial building. The city did that. And when we came, we were welcomed and encouraged to open up a commercial industry here in the building. And for 25 years, there hasn't been anyone that has put more money and had more stewardship in the front of the building than I. Not the city, not the landlord. I'm the one who paints it, upkeeps it, fixes the roof, patches things, and with the help of my wife, tries our best to keep the historical integrity of the building. But we are running a business. We are facing, and let me back up and say, I understand that the format here is the historical board. So the economic concerns are not your primary concern. I understand that, but hear me out. Restaurants, first of all, because of the historical nature of the building and all the steps and nooks and crannies, it wasn't built as a restaurant. Obviously, it was built as a library. Is very, very, very difficult to operate. The sheer fact that there were 6 restaurants in the property before us testimony that this isn't an easy building to run. It's labor intensive to bring up food and run this operation in a high volume restaurant in this building. And it cost a lot of money. And we are faced with a law that was enacted, Colorado Law Amendment 70, that has increased the minimum wage. And restaurants historically, the employees are paid a tipped wage. 5-6 years ago, it was $2.13 an hour. Today, it's $8.10 an hour, going up 90 cents. I know this doesn't seem like a lot to people that are not in the industry, but for an industry that works on pennies, this is devastating. devastating. Large restaurants are leaving the state of Colorado because they can't afford to do business here anymore. We are doing everything we can. I know that the persona is that we're just printing money. Well, everyone sees the people coming in, but nobody sees all the money that's going out. It's a very, very difficult business to run. And we picked it, we chose it, so this is our burden. But, excuse me, I'm not a public speaker. We want to stay here. We lived here. We bought our starter home on Bemis. We raised our children here. We run our business. We feel that we are a part of this community, and we would want to keep our restaurant here. When we arrived here and opened up our business, the city, downtown was just a different version of what it is right now. And that building was in a state of dilapidation. We are the ones that have fixed it up. We are the ones that have taken care of it. But we had to face the option of how to deal with these economic challenges. And one of the ways to do it is to try to increase business. And that's why we moved out to the patio. And we went through the procedures and to get the seating out on the front. But we faced more challenges that we need to sit at these tables during the winter. We're a special occasion restaurant, for those of you who are not familiar. So holidays are traditionally the times that we are good business for us, that, Black Friday or where you make money and show a profit. Those are in the winter time. And so we were faced with the fact of trying to utilize these tables. Tables are money, a revenue to make ends meet. When we don't like tents. I know I stated that, but let me state that again. We don't like the tents either. We're not here to keep the tents. We're trying to get a compromise. But be what it was, we went to the city and inquired before we went to put these tents up. And the city pointed us to the fire department, and we went and showed them our plans, and they approved it and gave us this temporary permit. So we didn't feel we were doing anything wrong. But we want to do better. We really would like to have a compromise of keeping the integrity of the front of the building. Obviously, these pergolas that we're about to talk about don't touch the building. They're actually much more low profile than the tents. The tents will go away, but we'll stay. We'll be here. These pergolas, hopefully this investment will allow the melting pot to continue here. And again, I do know that the mission here is the historical board and the integrity and the corridor view. And I'm coming at from a more of a compromised business situation. So I would hope you would understand our point of view that we're looking for a compromise, because 30% of our revenue comes from the revenue generated on the patio in the wintertime. If we lose that, I really don't know if we can stay. That's just it. And then I guess the question is going to be, can we come with a compromise? And is the melting pot, the anchor, they've been here 25 years, is the city a better place with it or without it? I'm going to turn it over to my wife, who will make a little more sense of this. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Would you state your name?
My name is Amy Reed.
Thank you.
And I just had a couple points that I wanted to bring up. In the existing conservation easement, there were drawings for what used to be Cafe Kandahar when they were in the building. And they show tables with umbrellas out front. And they also show awnings covering the entire top of the 3 arches in the front. The pergolas that we've come up with only would block 10% of the front facade. So my argument is that what's already approved in the conservation easement that we have not done blocks more of the building than what we're proposing, as well as the trees block more of the building than what we're proposing. And we have actually in the past asked to remove trees and been denied by the city. So I just wanted to kind of balance the things that you're hearing and kind of tell you what our perspective was on why this might possibly be an acceptable solution. Understand that if you approve the amendment to the conservation easement, you're not approving the pergolas. We still have to go through that approval process. But right now, what the conservation easement states is a very vague, uninterrupted view of the building. It doesn't say from what point, from how many feet away. It doesn't say if there's an acceptable percentage of coverage that still allows you to view the building that that would be okay to do. It's just, the city paid $10 to get this conservation easement. And essentially, we have 83 seats at the tables out front, and that's a full 30% of our business. So I'm just asking for the opportunity to present you with a potential solution to our problem of needing the seating out front, because right now, everybody's hands are tied by the language in the conservation easement. It doesn't allow for anything. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there questions for the applicant?
If I could add just one post note.
Go ahead.
I have heard the mention of trying to find compromises of other options. And I do want to make clear that we have thought about this and looked at the different options besides just leaving, which obviously we don't want to do. To the north, we have the parking lot, and it's a parking lot. I think if looking at that, that's not an option. But to the south, there is the park. And an initial review, it would seem like that would be an option. But what most people don't know, I didn't know either, that property is not owned by the city, it's owned by the Department of Transportation. And although there could be a possibility of a short-term lease with the Department of Transportation, they have bigger plans that with that piece of property. We would only be able to get a short-term lease, and we would not be able to recoup our money. Then we'd have to be gone. It'd be a temporary solution, and the investment in time to turn that park into usable tables is just not really economically feasible. But we have looked at the options besides putting tables and doing commerce on the east side of the building. So for what that's worth, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions for the applicants?
I do have a question. How wide are the pergolas on either side of the main entrance?
They're about 20 feet wide.
Okay, so if
the uprights are 6 inches wide and the horizontal member is 8 inches tall.
And are you set on that 20 feet wide, or could there be a compromise made on the width of those so that they were further out from the front door?
The size was determined on what would actually cover the tables. And because they're rated for snow load, they don't require a pitch or anything, so there's just a minimal upright and horizontal member that you'd be able to look right through to see the building, which is actually better than the umbrellas we put out in the summertime and far better than the red tents that nobody likes, including us.
Okay, and can you tell me a little about the screens that you propose using?
The pergolas are available with screens that are built into a track and on a remote control. So if weather blew in and we needed some protection, we could drop them down and put them right back up. Obviously, we don't have the ability to modify the tents once they go up. We also have thought about the idea of, if we get approval to do these, when the screens get dropped down during cold weather, doing a full-size imprint of what the building looks like on the screen, such as you would see if you had a historic building somewhere being renovated and they had scaffolding up, how they do those full-size prints, so that you can still see what the building looks like. I did verify with the manufacturer that they would be able to do something like that.
Okay. Another question I had was, if the city did approve the pergolas and at some time in the future the melting pot left the area, would you be willing to pay for the pergolas to be removed?
Absolutely.
If you left, okay.
And one of the reasons we're considering the pergolas is because understanding the integrity of the front of that building, we can't attach anything to it. We wouldn't want to. And these would be strictly anchored into the concrete with nothing touching the building. There'd be no possibility of damaging the historic facade. And I did the calculations, not including the roof, just on the front of the building and which parts of the pergola would actually be lined up with the front of the building. And it blocks less than 10% of the view when they're open.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Other questions?
I have a question about that. So you're saying when it's just the structure and no screens or anything
Right.
like that, then it blocks 10%.
Yeah.
But you mostly want to use these in the winter. So, maybe, maybe 6 to 9 months of the year, they would probably be permanently, semi-permanently closed to keep it warm, or would you?
Well, realistically, we don't heat it during the day when we're not using it. It would mostly be in the evenings. So we would actually have the ability to keep the screens raised and only drop them down when we need to pump the heat in when we're seating the tables. It would be way more flexible than the tents that we currently have.
You heat in the tents right now?
We do, yeah.
But in this structure, you wouldn't have to. Why?
We would need the sides down to heat it, but we wouldn't need to leave them down when we're not running the heat.
Same.
Yeah,
Okay.
Sorry if I didn't make that clear.
No, I'm just catching up. So 10% when they're open, which is, this is what I'm struggling with, not very long.
Yeah.
Most of the year, a lot more than 10% of the front is covered. It's like, I don't know, more than half. That's how it looks on the pictures. Should I be seeing it from a different elevation point or something?
Well, when the screens are down, they're certainly it would block a little bit more of it. But if we did a full-size print on them,
That might be an operational issue for the restaurateur.
Go ahead.
Approximately, in the summertime, we would only put them down for rainstorms. Otherwise, they would be open. Yes, in the wintertime, on the wintertime, it'd be like pay-as-you-go. We would take them up when we're not using, and then we would put them down when we are using. But there are a lot of shoulder months where we wouldn't be using the tables at all. After Mother's Day, we don't use the tables until later in the summer. So there would probably, I'm guesstimating here, there'd probably be 4 months where there wouldn't be anybody sat on the tables outside, and during those times we would open it.
Okay, thanks. And you're right, the design is much lovelier than the red tent, so, nicely done there.
I have a question. I'm struggling with the picture, the 10%, the up, the down, and when you're using them, when they're not. So when do you use these outside seating? Is it just summer, or summer and winter, or you're talking about certain times of the year? I don't understand.
Well, we use the tables most of the year, but in the summertime, we switch out to the umbrellas. So these would take the place of the umbrellas,
So the structures are permanent, but you're talking about the sides up and down, is that?
The sides have retractable screens that are on a remote control.
So it's the screens that change, but the structure stays
The
the same?
screens change, yeah.
So
the structure, just out of necessity, has to be anchored, because otherwise that thing could become windborne in a bad storm and crash into the building, which would defeat the purpose of preserving it.
So I don't understand, only 10% is not visible. I'm struggling with that. To me, you can't see any of it, but where's the 10% coming from?
The 10% is coming from looking at the horizontal and vertical members that line up with the front of the building.
Okay.
Because all of the structural elements are in line with each other, so when you're coming down the street, the view that you would have straight on, I'm saying that the structural pieces of the pergola only cover 10% of the facade.
As long as the screens are up.
Right.
Yes. And that does not include the roof, which would significantly reduce that percentage. I was only looking at the
And then
front.
just last point of clarification, how many months of the year are the screens down, do you think?
Probably 4 or 5. What would you say?
During winter, or is it summer?
It's a little bit vague because there, even in our busier times in the wintertime, when we were not sitting the tables during the day, we would open it up. And then we would put them down when we would have the business.
Which would be the evening?
In the evenings,
Okay.
majority.
Thank you.
I have a question about that. What time of day would you need to seal up the pergolas to heat them for dinner service in the winter?
In the winter, okay, and this would be business permitting or the demand. We are a dinner house primarily, although we do serve lunch. In the summertime, there's a demand for sitting out on the tables during the day, but most of our business is still in the evening. So in the wintertime, a hypothetical week is that we would keep them open during the day when there was no business and then shut them at night. Now there's certainly weekends, Saturday night is restaurant night, or a Christmas Eve where we would have the demand for more business on the patio during the day. Well, then of course we would shut those for business. Like a bad joke, or no, we pay as we go. We would drop them. If we didn't have any business, we'd open them up.
Well, I guess my question is, what time of day would you have to drop the sides in order to heat the building for the dinner service? And what time does your dinner service
30
begin?
minutes, drop them and then turn on the heat.
Like 5 o'clock or 4:30?
Is the question how long does it take to drop them and get it ready, or when we would open
Basically,
it?
yes. When does your dinner service start, and when would you need to drop the sides and begin heating the structure for the dinner service?
I'm going to say about 30 minutes to drop it and heat it up and turn on the lights and get the table set up. And in the evening, our dinner service starts at 5, although
Okay.
we are open for lunch.
Okay, so in the wintertime, conceivably, you would have to drop it in the morning in order to heat them for the lunch service as well. Is that right? Or-
If the demand was there, in saying that, I mean, I don't have exact numbers, but we are still primarily a dinner house. We do have some business for lunch. Majority of our lunch business year-round still wants to sit inside. But if there was a demand to sit on the patio in the wintertime for lunch, we would drop that down. And we open at 11, so we would probably turn it on or drop the screens and turn on the heat about 10:30.
Okay, thank you.
Poppy, question?
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. So I'm glad you mentioned earlier, changing tack a little bit, I'm glad you mentioned earlier talking to CDOT about the south side of the property. Have you or the property owner discussed with CDOT purchasing that portion?
It was our understanding that they would not be open to that. When Charlie Blosson was the city manager, we had kind of explored the possibility of doing something on that south side, and it was kind of prompted because in the drawings in the conservation easement, it shows a big atrium over there. So we thought, well, yeah, we could use that. And we were going to do our patio seating out there. Several things came out of that exploring. There's a high level of noise and pollution over there because of Santa Fe. The city used to have fountains over there that they abandoned because they were always clogged with dirt and debris. And then in addition to that, you have the traffic noise. So we actually hired a sound engineer to evaluate that for us. And he was recommending that if we were going to use it for seating, that we put up those sound walls that you see adjacent to the interstates. And we didn't feel like that would be very attractive on any level from, the city standpoint, from residents. If you were sitting there, it wouldn't be very attractive. We kind of scrapped that. And then Charlie came back to us and said, oh, you know what? That whole property is owned by CDOT. You can't do anything over there.
So even if you were able to acquire that property from CDOT, that's not something you would want to pursue because of the noise and the air pollution?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, because it really is a problem. We have constant trash and dirt that blow into the parking lot and into that park as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? David?
I have one additional question. I understand, we're primarily looking at amending the easement here, and we're getting into some details, and if so move forward, we would see a more formal site sketch. But I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the pergola structures you are looking at. Do they require any sort of foundation work, and how close to the structure would those elements be?
I haven't scaled out exactly how far away they are. I would say roughly about 10 feet. They are structural pergolas, so what we would need to do is do a footer underneath it, and then it would be attached at the surface level. The good part about that is if we ever wanted to take them away, they'd be easy to remove. It doesn't affect the building itself in any way. But they do need to be anchored down because, you can't just have something that big sitting out there without being attached.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Amy?
One other follow-up question. So you talked about the CDOT property on the south side of the building, and then you mentioned that you had considered the north side of the building for potential patio seating, but that wasn't attractive because of the parking lot.
Well, part of the problem with the parking lot is prior to it being a parking lot, it was used as a dump, and there's methane gas under the parking lot, so we have a lot of problems with the asphalt heaving and things like that.
Okay.
It would be cost prohibitive to try to do anything over there because of that. Any kind of foundational work for any sort of structure on that side would require that what's under the parking lot be cleaned up first.
Okay.
And we don't own the parking lot, the city does.
I was just going to say, is that city, that is city property, isn't it?
Yeah,
Okay.
we have a lease to use the parking lot from the city, but
Right.
I don't even know what would be involved in trying to build something over there.
Okay, thank you.
Plus we need the parking.
Sure. I have a couple. When did the umbrellas and the tents go up, Amy?
8 or 9 years ago, we've been getting them temporary permits for them for 8 or 9 years.
Okay, thank you. And who chose the color red?
I did.
Okay. That seems to be a bone of
Trying to
contention.
blend, the umbrellas were red. I was trying to keep it synchronized. Restaurant colors.
Okay.
I made a mistake.
All right, thank you very much. Any other questions? Okay,
I have one more question.
Kim has one.
As far as the material on the screens, you described that, and it sounds to me like they would be opaque. Is that correct?
Not completely. I think probably the most comparable thing that you would recognize are like the solar shades that you roll down. It's similar fabric and similar weave. So it's tight enough that it can, kind of hold in the heat and stuff, but it's really not thick. It's and like you would see light coming out and stuff like that.
Is there the opportunity for not a translucent material, but a clear material that you could see through to the building itself and see the diners and all of that?
I don't know the answer to that question, but that would be an option that I would certainly be willing to explore.
Thank you.
I do have one last question. What are the roof material made of?
It doesn't have a roof per se. It has slats that are mechanical.
Like
They're
louvers?
They're louvers, and so we can either open them, close them. You can close them all the way down, and they latch together to make it waterproof if it's raining or snowing. But those are hidden behind the 8-inch horizontal member.
Okay.
So it really has a nice benefit compared to like the tents or the umbrellas, because those require a slope for rain and snow runoff. And these are rated for snow load, and there are built-in gutters around the inside that you don't see. So it would probably be as minimal as we could possibly do and still cover the tables.
Can they accept a snow load as well?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So they're structural?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Anybody else have a question? Okay, then I think we'll entertain a motion. Thanks very much.
Thank you for your time.
Sorry, go ahead. One more.
One more question.
One more
question. It's probably more for staff, frankly, or for folks on the board, but I'm wondering, this is about the easement itself. And
Correct.
Let's say this easement gets amended, then the next step is they still have to come through the process, and we talked about which guidelines would be used to decide at that time what would happen. And I know in the past, sometimes we see things that we don't feel like we have maybe very specific guidance, so that it's easy for us to understand kind of what, how to realize the vision of the community through those guidelines. So I'm just wondering if we can repeat one more time, if this were to be amended so specific as they've written, which is helpful because that doesn't open the door to all kinds of other things that could hinder that amendment. But then what guidelines would we use to decide in the future if this did get amended? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first step would be a staff review of the pergolas. So staff would review, first of all, the zoning requirements. These include things like the open space, any parking requirements. Staff has concerns that the site can even meet the open space requirement as it currently exists, because I'll move back to this slide. You can see where the property, where the structure is here, indicating with the mouse. To the north of that, the property extends up into the parking lot. Now these lines can be off by several feet sometimes, but staff has concerns that there might be not sufficient open space as it is. Adding these additional pergolas might even require a variance application to be submitted and requested prior to the construction of these. So once you kind of get through those zoning hurdles, then you have to look at staff will review the application based on the downtown design standards. So these are the standards that were recently changed from guidelines to the standards. There are standards that talk about the materials that can be used in the brick, and how facades articulate and align with the existing setbacks of historic structures. These are also things that staff hasn't reviewed specifically but has concerns about. So there would be that review, and then I do believe that there is a certificate of appropriateness review from your board that would take place after that. So those would be the potential review steps that would follow an amendment if approved.
Certainly, approving the amendment would not give us approval to go forward. We would still have to go through all the proper processes. It would just open up the possibility and give you all a chance to evaluate what we're proposing on its own merits, rather than just a flat no, because we have this vague, uninterrupted view that the conservation easement guarantees that doesn't really give any guidelines for doing anything.
And all we're doing tonight is making a recommendation to City Council.
Yeah, I understand. I'm just, the details of, I was trying to anticipate in the future exactly what design standards we'd be applying. That's okay. That helps me. Thanks.
Yeah, the way I understand it is that because the pergolas would not be attached to the building,
right,
we'd be using the downtown design standards as opposed to the historic preservation standards.
Right.
So
yeah,
there'd be a difference there. Correct, Rob?
That's my understanding based on my conversations with Andrea Mimno.
Thanks. Okay.
And this is another question, it's kind of getting a little outside our preview, but a lot of this has to do with the economic viability of your company, of course, which we're all in favor of. But I assume that you've explored other options for if you lost that front seating on how you could make up that revenue. I mean, there's other things. I'm not a restaurant person, but I don't know if there's other options.
Moving, I guess.
So that's it. It's either moving, there's no other internal operational things that you've explored other than that.
We don't have the ability to add more tables inside. We're already maxed out.
Our profits are in that last 30% of the revenue that is generated. Losing that revenue, I mean, we can try to go with less staff, and there's obviously cost-cutting matters that we could do internally. We try to do every day. Would it be able to compensate for the loss of 30% of our revenue? No.
Thank you.
And I assume you've pursued options within Littleton's economic development and in other city departments instead of just looking at this?
In what way do you mean?
Well, you know, Littleton, I would say Littleton's probably very interested in keeping the melting pot. I mean, you've certainly been a fixture in the community for many years. So I would hope that you're working with the city in other areas besides just this. That's all I'll say. So I encourage you to do so.
The city actually encouraged us to approach this from amending the easement first.
Yes, I'm Mike Sutherland, the Deputy Community Development Director. This is sort of the first step, but if this did not pan out, we would definitely work with the applicant if they decided that the facility no longer worked to try and keep them in Littleton. They are a highly valued corporate citizen of the city of Littleton.
So this might not be the last gasp effort.
No, we definitely want
Very good.
the
Thank
melting
you.
pot to stay in Littleton.
Thanks, Mike. All right. We ready for a motion? Thank you very much, applicant.
Thank you.
Would anybody like to make a motion?
Get the motion language. Pam, you
have one
wanted
there?
additional language in it?
Yeah, I can make a stab. I'm going to make a motion to recommend denial of the amendment. I move to recommend the denial of the proposed amendment to the conservation easement and approve the HPB Resolution 02-219 based on the following findings. The proposed amendment would reduce the valuable protections provided by the existing conservation easement to the historically significant structure. The proposed amendment would undermine the intent of the existing conservation easement and impede the visible enjoyment of the Carnegie Library. The proposed amendment is not in the best interest of the city of Littleton and the general public. The proposed amendment does not grant a full and free right to the uninterrupted visual enjoyment and maintenance of the exterior facade of the improvements. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And the proposed amendment I have to make sure this is right. The proposed amendment would agree to maintain the exterior of said improvements in the architectural style equivalent to the architectural style of the exterior and facade of said improvements existing of the date of this instrument, that being the easement, and agrees that they will not later remodel or construct any improvements or the structure that does not conform to the architectural style of the presently existing improvements.
Second?
I'll second. That's the easy part.
All right, discussion.
I just want to make sure I said that right.
I think you did, Pam.
Okay, because I wanted to add those two things from the easement. I think that was important, that was quoted by staff in there. I want to say this is so difficult. The Melting Pot is a great restaurant. It's just our preview is to, our purpose is to somehow maintain historical downtown Littleton for all the property owners. And if we start changing the facades of our iconic buildings, that impacts every business. And that's what's so difficult here in this decision this recommendation we're making.
You know, I have to say, I really did not like the red tints, but I think this easement is so vague, and the city has allowed for 8 or 9 years a temporary lease to use umbrellas in front of the building, almost saying to the Melting Pot, this is okay to have something in front. I have to say, I don't feel like I want to deny it. I think the times are different. I think that it doesn't touch the building. I think with the pergolas, the way that they've been recommended or shown, as you drive down the west towards the mountains, you can still see the buildings. The fact that a tree would break this easement in front of the building says it's just too vague. So I would like to say, no, I don't want to deny it, and let it go the next course, because we'd have other venues to look at it and other places to talk about it, and the city could decide. I just think it's the easement is too vague. And the drawings on the original easement showed, showed trees, it showed, gosh, what are those called over the windows? I can't even
Awnings.
think. Awnings. So, and it really bothers me that for 8 or 9 years, the city allowed them to do umbrellas. To me, that's like saying to someone, yes, 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 yes. And then when you go to do something a little bit more permanent, no. I'm not comfortable with this. That's my opinion.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, I'd like to just applaud the applicant for making the best effort and trying to find a solution that minimizes the amount of coverage of the historic building. I think the inventory that we have of historic structures helps contribute towards the character of the city, helps influence the vitality and success, just as the business does. They bring people down, they grow, just as the city grows as well. However, I'd still come back to the fact that, our role here is to advise City Council on matters pertaining to the historic character of the city. And looked at that narrow lens with this easement, it is tough.
I looked at this old document with maybe a little bit of lack of sophistication that we have evolved today, that maybe it would be a much tighter document. But I think the intent is very clear. I think that the intent was own this building, take care of this building. We're glad to have you as a tenant, but we as a city want to have the enjoyment of the facade. If this was written today, it would probably be a much different document, much more sophisticated, much longer, much more detailed, and probably have a lot of lawyers involved. So I just think we have to look at it in the context of the time it was written.
But that's not the easement we're talking about. We're talking about the easement that's on paper now.
Right, that was written in 1983, which is a real long time ago. But it was written a long time ago with a sophistication level that I think we would be more sophisticated writing today. So I don't think we can blame the authors of this for not being as clear as maybe they should have, or as buttoned up. I think the intent is very clear on what they were trying to do, from my perspective.
Andy?
Yeah, I'm struggling a little bit too, because it's an iconic building, it's an iconic restaurant that contributes for a long time to this community. And if ultimately we're trying to protect the buildings, we want viable businesses in them. What I'm struggling with is this is an easement that protects the view of the building. And so it feels more restrictive, right? Like and this is where I was trying to go with my questions, and should have spent more time looking at this in our guidelines, but if this easement were not in place, they're proposing things that are not really permanent, not touching the building, not harming the building, and making every effort they can to minimize the look and feel. Like those red tents, I think a lot of people didn't like them because they're so obvious and they're always there. And these wouldn't have that same, I think, visual impact. So I guess I'm still struggling a little bit with the fact that this is an easement of the view of the building, not an easement to protect just the facade, right? It's a, you know, just the view. So I'm trying to decide how much this structure messes that up. I could use some more help.
I agree with Pam. I think that short of parsing the words of the amendment or of the easement as it was written in 1983, I think the intent is there to preserve this historic structure, an iconic historic structure that really is the focal point as you head west on Main Street. I mean, it kind of defines and anchors the historic area. I think as a board, what we're struggling with is this notion that we all want to have balance between a thriving, economically healthy downtown, which, you know, is one of the reasons we're able to preserve these historic buildings. But the historic buildings, you know, provide the setting for these businesses to thrive. And I'm asking myself, what is our intent here, or what is our purpose here as a board? It's to, you know, it's historic preservation. And I think by disregarding the intent with which the easement was written, I think that we're not doing we wouldn't be doing our jobs to preserve the historic aspect, the historic facade of this building.
I also struggle with this. The pergolas are reversible. They could be removed in a year, in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years. But amending the easement is permanent. And that is what I really struggle with. In the intent of that easement, the importance of the easement remains. And I think that's permanent, whereas the structures, you know, are reversible at some point.
Bobby, any comments? Lisa? Okay.
Mike?
Yes?
After I did this amendment, let me throw something out to the group. One thing that I've heard from our conversation, maybe it should be amended that something that we're recommending the denial of the amendment, but somehow in there that we're concerned about the economic viability of our property owners and tenants. Because when this goes to City Council, it doesn't come with any sort of narrative discussion. All they do is read that. The other thing, maybe we want to amend it, which we could do, or vote on the motion and then redo it, would be to bring up what Kim brought, that any change to this easement is permanent. And that maybe the melting pot is a responsible corporate property owner, but the next one may not be. And if they decided to move or, you know, change their business or retire or whatever, then this easement is there, it doesn't change. It would be hard to get it back again.
We're not going to get it back.
Yeah. So maybe what we need to do is think about, I don't know if this is what we want to do. I just put it out to the group that maybe we do put something about economic viability, and once we do this, it's permanent and impacts future property owners that could be more even radical in terms of changing the facade.
You want to withdraw your motion, Pam, and then restate your motion?
Do we have to vote on it and then, or can we amend it?
If you're going to amend it, you have to vote on the amendment first and then go back to the original motion. So if you're going to amend it, you need a motion and a second to amend the pending motion vote on that, and then you vote on the pending motion with amendment.
Do we have to have specific language?
I think you need it at this point.
Okay, even to vote to amend?
Right.
Okay.
I don't know, what are your thoughts? I mean, I'm just throwing it out to the group that maybe we do want to amend the motion.
I think you do want to amend the motion. I think that's a really good point, because you're right, City Council does just read what we send them, and I think we probably should give them a little bit more information on what we're recommending.
If we, because we're in discussion mode now, if we did amend it, how would you want to amend it? First of all, to talk about the economic viability, our concern about economic viability of our property owners, and then what to say about the permanence. I mean, do we want to say, start with it at the beginning, that HPV is very concerned about the economic viability of our property owners in downtown Littleton?
I think I had one other thing I'd like to add, just to the discussion. I think as a board here in our charter is, unfortunately as it is, economic viability is not part of our duty and our role.
Well,
as much as I understand,
think
I think it's our duty to advise City Council on matters pertaining to historic preservation.
We have, it's not part of our mission statement. Okay, so our mission statement is the Historical Preservation Board works to preserve the built environment that gives a unique sense of place and identity to our community. Further, the Historical Preservation Board encourages reinvestment and the compatible growth which enhances the Littleton's economic viability. Okay. So it's part of what we need to be concerned about.
And that's generally Littleton's economic viability, not specifically for an individual business, is that
right,
correct?
it's Littleton. Okay, so there is some precedent for that. I mean, we have to take that into consideration.
But to Kim's point, it's viability of individual businesses and long-term viability of a historic preservation district to promote economic growth.
Yeah, and it's Littleton's long-term economic viability.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking for the resolution here. Do we have it, Andy?
We only have this. Oh, the resolution.
Resolution itself. I mean, to me, Pam, this suggests that this should be part of the resolution, that, we're concerned about the viability of the business and that this would be a permanent reversal of an easement. That I think, is where that should be. So in the resolution itself, as opposed to in the motion.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. If I could make a suggestion, maybe the thing to do is to make another finding of fact as an amendment, and then have that finding of fact, vote on that is approved to the original motion, and then have those findings of fact as part of your narrative that then goes to the council.
Can we have narrative that goes to council?
Well, no, it would be another finding of fact. You have, in your motion, you had a series of findings of fact.
Right.
That was part of the motion. If you wanted to amend that, you could add a different finding of fact as you see fit.
So just amend the original motion as opposed to rewriting it?
Yeah, vote on that additional finding of fact, that would then be added to the motion, and then that additional finding fact would go to council with your vote.
You want to make that motion, Pam?
Okay. Can we discuss it before we make it? Can we discuss the wording to make sure that the group kind of agrees? Can we say, after discussion, we further want to amend our motion that the HPB has considered the economic viability of Littleton in this decision, and that any change in the easement would be permanent and impact of the future of the property for years to come?
I think procedurally where you would be now is you would move to amend the original motion by adding another finding of fact, and then include whatever that finding of fact would be, and then that have to be seconded, approved, and then that would go to your original motion as amended.
And can I move to amend it?
Sure.
Okay. I move to amend our original motion to add two additional fact findings, one having to do about HPB's concern about the economic viability of Littleton, and one to point out that this would be a permanent change to this easement.
Okay, second to that amendment?
I second.
Second, okay. Any discussion on that amendment?
I have discussion.
Okay,
Sorry.
Kim?
I would like to see that specifically say that HPB, recognizes and appreciates that the melting pot is a long-term, has been a great contributing business to the community of Littleton.
So do we need to withdraw that motion and restate the motion?
Robert's rules are not strictly followed in Littleton. Under Robert's rules, I think you could accept that as a friendly amendment, restate the amendment, and have a second on the restated amendment, and then proceed.
All right. Pam's still writing. We'll get it here.
I have a question. So,
Sure.
would it have to be a permanent change to the easement?
Could it be a term? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Is that a staff question? I sure don't have the
I don't
answer.
know. I mean, does it have to be a permanent change to the easement?
Could it be a variance, in other words?
Yeah.
Well, it's a recorded document, ultimately, so it would be a permanent change.
This board is making recommendations to council. If council were to adopt something, it would be a change as council saw fit, because they're the only ones with authority to make that.
Okay.
Okay, so would we put permanent in our amendment then?
If I could bring up one thing also, finally piping up. The actual language in the amendment to the conservation easement, we've talked a lot about what the pergola would look like and that the visible, it wouldn't be super visually intrusive, but the actual language is very vague about the pergola, so it would be allowing the grantor to affix to the patio on the east side of the structure a four-season pergola, and that's all it says. It doesn't say that the pergola would only take up 10% of the facade, so I think that's just something that you guys should consider in addition to just the general permanent nature of the change to the easement is the language that the change is.
Good point, thank you.
So in other words, it would permit a pergola, and it doesn't specify that it has to be a very minimal pergola. It could be any kind of pergola they want. Is that right?
Correct. It's not, I mean, there would be the process afterwards, but to get approval for that. But if you're making the decision based on what this pergola is imagined to be, that might not be actually what is going to be proposed.
Okay. So that wouldn't be appropriate.
Okay, I did not include your point because I'm not sure exactly how to include it.
It's not really, my point, I was just making my point not to be included in the motion, but you were talking about the permanent nature of the easement, and so I wanted to point out that the language that was given in our staff report is very vague about what would be in that easement.
Okay.
But the easement is permanent, and the change to the amendment is
Okay,
permanent.
so can I read this to you?
Sure.
This is not the amendment. This is open for discussion. Okay, our amendment would be, HPB recognizes and appreciates that the melting pot has been a contributing, has contributed to the economic viability of Littleton. We also want to add that we recognize any change to the easement would be permanent and would impact future property owners and open the door to future changes to the view of this building for the city. I have no pride of authorship.
Okay. All right, second on that one? Will it die for lack of a second?
Could you read it again, please, Pam?
I just want to, before I actually make the amendment, I want to see if you agree with it. The amendment would read.
Pam, I think you need to make the amendment first, and then we need to.
Discussion.
Discuss it.
Okay. I move to make an amendment to the original motion that says HPB recognizes and appreciates that the melting pot has been a contributing company to the economic viability of Littleton. In addition, we want to recognize that any change to the easement would be permanent and would impact future property owners and open the door to future changes to the view of this building.
Okay, now a second?
Second.
Okay, all right, now discussion on the amendment.
And in the original motion, we do talk about the intent of the easement, is that correct? Yes.
We talked about, yeah. We mentioned that the city has a free right of uninterrupted visual enjoyment, maintenance of the exterior facade. We talked about improvements, agrees that they will not, that the property owner will not later remodel or construct any improvements or structure that does not conform to the architectural style of the presently existing improvements.
So I have a question of the group. Would the group feel more comfortable if, to Commissioner Hood's point, would they feel more comfortable if the easement amendment language was much more specific and limiting and restrictive? Because you're right, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think the integrity of the business owner is not under question, and the designs look, interesting and better and all those things, but that's not what we're here to discuss today. It's the easement and the permanent nature of affecting that easement. So I'm wondering, does it even make sense to try to encourage easement language that does give people a little more comfort that the view of the building is not as obstructed? May not come to that, I'm just throwing it out there.
I think we're dealing with this document, and we have to kind of deal with the document, and should we allow it or not? That's my opinion.
Okay. Should we vote on the amendment? All in favor? You want to restate
Sorry,
it?
Chair. Yeah, we should do
Restate
a roll
it?
call
Okay,
vote.
Pam, would you restate it?
Okay, it's tough. I put forward a motion to recommend.
Did we have a second on the restated amendment?
I did.
Thank you.
Okay. The motion is to recommend the denial of the amendment. I move to recommend.
First, we need to vote on the amendment.
Oh.
So do the amendment first.
Just the amendment.
Okay.
The amendment.
Okay, so you want me to read the amendment?
Just the amendment.
Just the amendment. All right, sorry about that. HPB recognizes and appreciates that the Melting Pot has been a contributing company to the economic viability of Littleton. It also recognizes that any change to the easement would be permanent and would impact future property owners and open the door to future changes to the view of this building to the city.
Board Member Fisher?
Aye.
Board Member Field?
Aye.
Chair Price?
Aye.
Board Member Grove?
Aye.
Board Member Spratlin?
Nay.
Board Member Gabriel?
Nay.
Board Member Hill?
Aye.
The motion carries 5-2 with Board Member Spratlin and Gabriel voting no.
So now do we have to vote on the whole motion?
Now we go back to the original motion.
Now we go back to the
You
original.
want that restated, Wendy? Would you like that restated as well? The original motion? We
Okay,
on
you're
that
good. And you're good with the amendment?
Okay.
Okay.
Any other discussion on the original motion? I just have a couple things. I've been on this board for 5 years, and I don't think I've ever seen staff not recommend a motion or an easement or anything like that. So it's very rare to have staff recommend denial, and I think we need to listen to our staff. They're the folks on the ground, and they're doing our job. Pam's already read the mission statement. I think that's very important for both sides of this argument. And I would just hope that if this passes, that the north and south options are a little bit more considered. That if we can preserve this eastern facade, that hopefully there's some way that we can get around the methane and get around the traffic noise and the things like that, and work with the city so that we can have this business can remain viable. So with that, shall I call the question? Amy?
Can I ask a clarification question first of
Sure.
all? Because we're it's double negatives here. So when I vote, it would deny the, okay, all right, so I'm ready now.
Everybody understand that?
So, well, let's state that. When we're voting to deny, what exactly
Right.
does that mean?
So an I vote says, now therefore be it resolved by the Historical Preservation Board that the board finds the proposed draft amendment in gross counteracts the intent of the original easement, and we recommend denial of the proposed draft amendment. That's correct, right?
A yes vote is to deny the applicant's
Got it.
request for an
Okay.
amendment to the easement.
The vote.
Tough going
We ready?
Are we ready for a vote?
First, but
I think we're ready for a vote.
Okay.
Board Member Fisher?
Aye.
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 Aye. The motion carries 7-0.
Thank you.
Thank you. We don't really have a public hearing, even though it's on the agenda. So let's move on to comments and reports from community development staff.
I don't have any.
Okay. Nothing, Jennifer?
No.
Mike?
Nothing, sir.
All right, thank you. Anything from the members? Well, then shall we adjourn the meeting at 8:17 and move to study session?
Do we want to set a time for the study session to give everyone a chance to take a quick break and set up? What time?
Sure, 8:25?
Okay.
8:26? Thank you very much. ready. We'll call the study session to order at 8:29 and 7 seconds.
Not watching train.
Are you ready, sir?
I'm ready. I'm Paul Kodak. I'm
Paul?
with Kissinger and Feldman, and we are your interim city attorneys. And how long we're interim and, all of that, I don't know, that's, city council has to decide who and when and all of that sort of stuff. So for now, we're filling the chair. And I'll be seeing you probably next month or whenever the next meeting is. So what they asked us to do is sort of kind of go over what you are, what you do, what your authority is, where your authority stops, where your recommendations go to council, things like that. And so I took last year's presentation and I made some adjustments and added a couple of things on the pages. So that's really what you're going to get here. So the Historic Preservation Board, Section 211.1 sets out a whole bunch of words, and it says the HPB operates pursuant to Title 4, Section 6 of the Littleton Municipal Code. And in Chapter 4, Title 4, Chapter 6, it lays out very specific duties that you have. And I don't want to just read these to you, but it starts with designation for historic preservation, and you make recommendations to council. You review and comment on recommendations or nominations from others who want to have a historic designation. And you assist in public education programs. And it's right, because everything that is on this list you guys have talked about tonight. I'm just like, oh, that's in the presentation. So, there was pictures of the historic library building on your public education materials and walking tours and things like that. One of the things we talked about tonight was, the certificates of appropriateness is one of the things you do, and that's listed as part of your duties. Economic hardship was discussed at length tonight, so I kept, telling Jennifer, I'm like, well, man, everything's a teachable moment tonight. So all of this stuff was actually within your purview tonight, and I thought you guys were very thoughtful and worked very hard at that. And so these are, within the scope of your duties, designated a historic landmark, contributing property, non-contributing property in a historic district. All of these are things to look at. But mostly you're just an advisory body and you give recommendations up to council, okay? So almost all situations that's the case, except you can make recommendations to the Planning Commission too, regarding design guidelines for historic districts. So one of the things that, this is up to you, but it just occurred to me when you were having this conversation tonight about, well, what does that easement say and how can we be more specific? It seems to me it would be within your purview if somebody wanted to say, all right, that language is a little general in that easement, but if you guys wanted to put together guidelines, some specific recommendations as to what that means and, adopt things like that for the Planning Commission, that could be something that would be within your purview to discuss, okay? So, council, they go to the voters and they have all the authority. So, they're the local legislative authority. They set the laws and the policies. So now, those laws and policies are set in Title 4, Chapter 6, and those are now the operating rules for you. You have to operate within those historic preservation guidelines, but council also appoints you folks. So to the extent that they're happy with you, you get re-upped and all that, that's wonderful. Okay? So I think that this was apparent tonight too, that there's different roles between what you do and what staff do. Now staff is, for the most part, a support mechanism, so they're going to schedule public hearings, they're going to send out the notices, maintain the meetings and records. Now, in a few places, like preparing staff reports, processing and reviewing certificates of appropriateness, they would be an adversary, not necessarily an adversary, but, advising you within the contours of those policies set by council. So somebody on the other side, an applicant, or like tonight, the business owner, might differ with them and have their point of view, but they feel like they're representing the public, they're representing the policy that the council has set, and they're advising you on their best estimate of how that goes. So on issues that are scheduling meetings, noticing, other assistance you need to, are we going to have enough photocopies, stuff like that, there's really not a big deal talking to staff. But if you're talking to staff about something that's to be before you, particularly if it's in a quasi-judicial matter, you probably shouldn't be having discussions with them that are substantive until that is there and all members of the board are able to hear all the same stuff. So the hierarchy of the laws so home rule charter is like the constitution of the city, and that sets sort of the guiding principle. Now, council can't even adopt stuff that would contradict with the charter. There would have to be a charter amendment. Now, last fall there was some charter amendments to allow for executive sessions of council and things like that, but that has to be approved by the voters. So that establishes the very broad framework under which all city government operates. The next level would be the ordinances or the municipal code, which is sort of the statute. So, if you were at the federal government, there'd be Constitution, there'd be the United States Code of statutes, and then there would be the rules of federal regulation. So here, we're now at the municipal level, the ordinances adopted by council are sort of the statutes that apply. Because City of Littleton is a home rule municipality, I used to know the Constitution, I think it's Article 20, Section 6 of the Colorado Constitution, allows us to be sort of self-regulating within our boundaries. And as long as there's not a state statute that contradicts our ordinances, we can adopt ordinances that are set stuff. Now, this is really tricky, and this has sort of come up in this legislative session with the regulation of oil and gas. Because for years, the oil and gas regulations always said the primary goal was to promote the use of the resource. And so the State Commission was to promote that. And so, health and environment and zoning and all of that stuff was off. And that statute actually said it preempts local control. So this year, they passed a change to that statute that said local control is important, health and the environment is important, and so now, the oil companies are screaming because they reversed that and said that there's local control. Now, I don't think there's going to be oil derricks in the middle of the city of Littleton, but I know in a lot of the cities like Evans and Greeley and places like that, they do have oil production within the city limits. And so they wanted it to comply with zoning and stuff. So the Colorado Municipal League was very much in favor of allowing local control rather than one size fits all for the entire state. So this can be a very tricky issue, and that's probably when you call your lawyer. If you've got some concern about, is a state statute telling us we can't even do that? So the HPP has adopted its guidelines, which are sort of the local regulations, and this is what we've talked about. If you wanted to have some more guidelines on how to apply that easement, I think that might be something that you could do. So, and you've done some of this already. And what was it somebody saying, your guidelines are now standards? That was not in last year's presentation. I don't know what that means. But I think that those are the kinds of things that when staff then has your direction, they can go and see where your thinking is on stuff and set those. And I think those are subject to some adjustment. Under the Colorado Open Records Act, pretty much everything you do, everything you rely on, unless it's legal advice with your attorney, is subject to the Open Records Act. So it's a public record subject to copying and inspection. And everything you have to do is subordinate to all those higher levels of law above you. So, you have to comply with the local ordinances, you got to comply with the charter, you got to comply with the state statute, you got to comply with the state charter. Okay? So you kind of live within that framework. talked about this. And I have not gone to look at all of your, because I kind of got this gig late, specifications and tables and stuff, but I think that that's a great thing for you guys to sort of get yourself familiar with and review from time to time, so you kind of know, I mean, I think there was some good questions tonight. Well, how does that apply with, our other, historic preservation stuff? How does that comply with the downtown development sort of thing? So those are good things to keep in mind. So let's talk about our meetings and interrupt me and ask questions if I'm going too fast. There's actually sort of some standard rules that all of the boards and commissions use in Littleton, which is good for a guy like me who goes to various different boards from time to time. I'll be back Thursday for something else. I think it's a good idea for you to take a look at that, follow them. We're going to kind of go over them tonight, but sort of, Ms. Grove was looking at it. She looked like she had her little bag of tricks over there that she keeps track of all of that stuff, and I think that's a great idea. I do that all the time. Okay. When I said tonight, we don't technically follow Robert's rules. They're more like Bob's guidelines. But I guess the city manager wants you all to leave with a copy of Robert's rules tonight. Robert's rules are highly technical. I've been parliamentarians for committees and groups, and it's a lot of brain damage. Pretty much the motion and second discussion and vote. That's all. We had some little technical stuff with amendment to the pending motion. You got to vote on that first and then go back. So it's worth reviewing, but I wouldn't get too uptight about it. As long as you kind of keep the meeting going and everybody can follow each other, I think it's all good.
Paul, if I could.
Yeah.
In the packet I handed out to you, there is about halfway through a one-page Robert's Rules cheat sheet that will kind of just go over the real basic stuff. If you don't feel like going home and reading the whole little book, you got. There's also a copy of the legislative rules in there. So.
Yeah, and I know some of you are just dying to go home and read Robert's rules. I think it's probably a sure cure for insomnia. So, as you saw tonight, we got sort of two stages. Well, I guess if it's an evidentiary meeting, we're taking two sides, and I think we were a little relaxed on that tonight, but I think it was appropriate. So you've got first the fact presentations, and then you get to the deliberation and fact finding. So usually you have presentation by the staff, like we saw tonight, and then the applicant on their side, and then you open it up for public discussion from other interested parties if you're having a full-blown hearing. What was his name? Paul Harvey, remember? You guys are too young to remember Paul Harvey. The rest of the story, right? So, I used to be able to tell this to jurors when I was trying cases. You got to be like Paul Harvey and wait for the rest of the story, right? You should keep an open mind throughout, because you're going to hear staff side, then you're going to hear the other side. Everybody did a great job of that tonight, but it's something that you got, there's more to come, right? So it's the way things come, so you got to take your time, and I think you did a great job asking clarifying questions and getting to that. And then you get to the deliberation stage and fact finding. Now, again, I think you did great job of that tonight. It was in the motion, you had some fact finding. You had some discussion in which you were, stating the facts on which you were relying to get to that, and this wasn't even an evidentiary hearing, right? So I think that is the kind of process that you want to follow, because if this is ever challenged for some reason, right? Now, it's usually not going to it's a recommendation to council, but, if for some reason there's a challenge on this, the goal is to give everybody procedural due process. Give everybody an opportunity to be heard in a meaningful time, in a meaningful manner. And as long as the record is clear you did that, you heard both sides, the record is clear you've made findings of fact consistent with the evidence that was before you, then you've made a good record, and if council wants to come back and look at that and say, all right, well, what did we consider that was different than what they heard? you know, they're making a recommendation that somehow we're confused by, they can go and check that. They can check on that. So all of that is very useful, okay? And then you take a vote at the decision-making stage. What'd you do to my slides? They didn't come in sequence when I wrote them. Anyway, you know, in a judicial setting, you wear robes in the United States. You don't wear a hat or a wig. So I think when you're quasi-judicial, you got to think of you're sort of sitting in the seat of a judge, right? And so or a juror, since there's a group, right? And you need to think about that for purposes of your Littleton hearings, that you want to make sure that you're giving everything fair. I mean, 14th Amendment to the Constitution says, no state shall deprive anybody of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Well, you guys don't have a death penalty, and you guys don't have locking anybody up, but you have property rights that come before you. So you have to give people due process of law in considering their property rights, okay? So the city, represented usually by staff, will make a presentation to all the boards and commissions, typically. And then the applicant has a chance. And then other interested parties have a chance. And that's part of the due process. And this can be a messy thing to watch. It was okay tonight, but sometimes you get a lot of people who are very upset about stuff. So after the notice goes out and you know what's on your agenda, you shouldn't be gauging an ex parte communication with involved parties. So you shouldn't be talking to staff and saying, well, what do you think? Or how? You should be asking those questions in front of everybody else so that you're all relying on the same information as if you were jurors, right? You shouldn't be going out and talking to people at the site, for example, or stopping the man on the street and having conversations, because you're getting information that everybody else isn't getting as far as that. Now, it was also very well done tonight that when you had information from somebody, I think it was you had talked to, you shared that with everybody. Okay, now everybody has the same information you have, and they're making the decision based on the same information, which is appropriate, okay?
Andy has a question.
Huh?
Question. Sorry, I thought you were done with that slide. I didn't mean to interrupt your train of thought, but just to clarify, to make sure I understand, quasi-judicial, tonight wasn't technically quasi-judicial, so we could have talked to people in this case, right, before the hearing, because they weren't.
But I still think it's appropriate then that you share it with everybody else. I spoke with these people.
Right.
This is what they told me. And so everybody understands all of the same information as far as making a decision. When I'm trying cases, the judge gives jurors all this instruction. You can't look up stuff on your cell phones. You can't go visit anything. You can't read newspaper articles. You shouldn't do anything outside of what's the presentation to making your decision, because everybody should have the same evidence and make the decision based on the same body of information. Okay? So you shouldn't do that. If you do make those site visits, then you need to communicate with everybody else and let staff know, particularly if it's something staff doesn't know about. And usually you can do that through, Colleen or director. I was out at the site, I heard this, and then get the information to them so that those folks can then consider that as well as part of their thinking process, because we don't want anybody to be left out.
So this is what we've done in the past, and I just want to make sure it's okay. We've made site visits where we've gone by a building, but if there's another HPE member, we don't discuss the packet or anything. We just look at the building and just so that we're informed.
The Board of Adjustment meeting, what was that, a couple of weeks ago when we were there, the chair actually said at one point, asked everybody, has anybody been to the site that we're considering? And did you talk to anybody? And everybody had a chance to then say, oh yeah, I drove by that, or I live in that neighborhood, I drive by it all the time, or yeah, I went and drove around and looked, and stuff like that. But then everybody knows, okay, I've seen it with my own two eyes. And then every one of them said, but I didn't talk to anybody. Okay? So, that's an appropriate thing to do. Yeah, go ahead.
If I can add one other thing, kind of going back to talking to staff, that's different than if you have a specific question about the packet that we've sent out to you, by all means, ask us that question. And what we do then is send our response to all of you, so you have all that information. So don't be afraid to ask a question, and we'll make sure we share it with all of you.
And don't be afraid to ask me a question, or somebody in my office, Ken Feldman, who's the actual acting city attorney. Remember that I will advise you by saying the board as a whole makes a decision. I will answer your question, but then I might also do the same thing that she suggested. Is I received a question, and this was the question, and this was the answer, so that all of you could have that. Now, if it's a question going to legal advice on something, I'm not going to say that in public. We might have to recess and have an executive session. It's probably not ever going to happen, but if it's something that's that kind of level of problem, that's an attorney-client communication. That's privileged and it can't leave. But I doubt that will ever happen with this body, but if it happens, I'm the one that will make the call, and I'll let you know. Okay? Because if it's waived for good. It's the genie's out of the bottle. You can't get it back in. So the orders of the proceedings, this is what we saw tonight. Staff presentation, applicant presentation, but in a public hearing that's quasi-judicial, presiding officer then has to open it up for public comment. And usually the public comment is limited in time. Final presentations, you get some sort of their closing arguments, if you will. And then close the public hearing, and there's a decision and a public vote. Okay? So, staff presentation, it's just like it went tonight. Overview of the facts, summary of the application and the request, gives you some guidance on what's the applicable provisions, what have we considered, what do we think is part of the, what are the ordinances that apply, what are the specific requirements, and maybe even your guidelines, what are your guidelines here, and they include a recommendation, okay? This is your chance to, and you did a great job, challenge them. Ask the question. Did you consider this? What about that? Right? That's part of this process. Did you want to go ahead? So then the applicant's presentation, sometimes it's the same stuff, which, is like watching concrete harden when they come back and give you the same history that you just got from staff. But usually they'll supplement the staff and say, okay, like those guys said, I'm just going to add on. Like tonight, they're going to put in a broader context. The staff was talking about all of the stuff that technically applies. These guys came in and said, well, we got all these, we got to be a viable business. We've got all these other considerations. We thought about that. We thought about this. We looked at other options. We're not just, coming in here shooting from the hip. We've been thinking about this. They're going to advocate for the result they want. And again, it's your chance to ask questions. This is your chance to sort of build the record. Get all the facts out of this that you need to make a good decision, right? It's another thing that drives me crazy when I'm trying cases, but the rules in the state of Colorado, the jurors get to ask questions, so I get to tiptoe around something that I don't want them to know about, and then they ask that question. I'm like, now I got to deal with that. So, but you get to ask those questions so that you get to make those decisions. When you open up the public hearing, usually there's limits in time, and otherwise people would come and filibuster and talk all night, and you get better things to do. If they've got stuff to say that hasn't already been said, I think that is really important stuff. What was it, the Board of Adjustment meeting? There was some people that came in from the public, they had some really insightful points, and the members were like, wow, yeah, that's really good. So I think that can be really helpful, and I think that it would be one of those things that, all right, well, let's maybe make a recommendation to council based on that, that nobody else had thought of up to that point. So I think it is really important. But the difference for these comments, it has to relate to the topic before you. Usually in a meeting you have the public comment, and people will say, why they want historic preservation and stuff like that. But, they can't go off on too far a tangent. It needs to be on the issue before you in a quasi-judicial setting. So this worked really well tonight, you know, and they don't repeat and keep redoing the thing. And I think that the chair has authority if somebody comes in and starts repeating, no, we've heard all of that. Is there anything new you want to add, right? So that we don't have to keep doing the same, you know, it would be like Groundhog Day, right? You keep waking up and hearing the same story. Final opportunity to ask questions. You guys did a great job at this tonight. So you've closed the public hearing, entertain a motion in a second. Encourage the discussion amongst you. You guys did a great job tonight making your findings, what you were finding persuasive, what was the evidence, and then listening to each other, which is really important, okay? And this is where you build your record, so that now if council, for some reason, wants to come and look at what you did, what you saw, what you talked about, I think that that's important for them as part of the evidence that they use, okay? You make a decision by a public vote, and it's usually just a recommendation to council. Now, council's going to have a separate hearing on this. Tomorrow night, I think it's on council agenda to consider this on first reading. Whatever you guys did tonight, they will consider on first reading, and then on second reading, they will have a public hearing, and it'll be a chance for everybody to kind of do the same thing again, and you know, maybe they'll polish their presentations. Okay, so that's your quasi-judicial role. You also have a little bit of a legislative role in you're making the decisions. You're setting what are the policies going to be, or what's the programs going to be for educational programs. How do you want to advise council on your own initiative on how to take up some new matters? So you might have some things that say, well, you know, your ordinances now on historic preservation say X. We think it needs to say X and Y. And you might start developing something like that where you are developing legislation. It's up to them eventually to approve it, but you might be in that position where you decide that you want to do something like that. You also have a legislative role when you can make some recommendations to the Planning Commission or on design guidelines. It's, you know, could be more on your initiative. Somebody else is going to have to adopt them and agree with you, but I don't think that you're completely limited in doing that. You also have a regulatory role in, you know, you're going to be looking at nominated properties and making recommendations to City Council. You know, how are you going to review nominated properties? Are you going to pick some of your own that you think might be useful? So I think that you can start taking that and then moving that up in a regulatory role as well. Any questions on that?
I have one.
Sure.
On the prior point. When we make a determination and it gets appealed to council or it goes to council, do we have the opportunity to testify?
That's an interesting question. Well, I think you would be like any other member of the public when it's open for public comment. I think you could go and say, you know, sign up and say, you know, I happen to be on the Planning Commission, but I'm a citizen too. I think you could appear.
Would we do that in an official role or as a private citizen?
I think you could do it as a private citizen for sure. I don't know. I mean, I think that if the board, it's an interesting question. I think if the board was...
I know that that's happened in the past, yeah. And they've always presented as a private citizen.
Yeah.
Because our board members are citizens of the city and may have a different view of whatever it is separate from their appointed.
I think, though, that the board could, I'm just trying to think, you know, I'm trying to brainstorm with you. I mean, if the board was to have strong feelings on something and say, you know, I really hope that when staff makes this presentation to council, they would, you know, press these points that were important to the board, I think staff would be very amenable to being your advocate on some of that sort of stuff. So that might be a way to get there. Yeah.
I guess I'll just throw out, if it's on something that we've heard and you had already a chance to articulate your views, then it could be perceived as divisive, potentially, if you went then to the, in my opinion, to the council and took another bite at that apple. But if it was on something that we didn't hear, but something else entirely, and you wanted to bring in your perspective as a citizen, that makes sense to me.
Well, I think your point's well taken. I mean, it's a 7-1 or 6-1 vote, and you show up at the council meeting as the one nay, and then you start advocating for something. It could be divisive for how the group operates as a whole.
It could also come back technically to the preservation board. And then would you have had an ex parte contact by going and presenting and being in that public hearing?
And this is a really good point, and I think that one of the things that, I mean, you go to council and say, I'm really interested in historic preservation, would you appoint me to your board? And you might be motivated because you think, council's statutes or the ordinances aren't right, or the rest of the board has been operating inappropriately, and then you get on the board and you think you have an agenda, but most of what comes before you is on the facts before you. And if you've already come in with a pre-made decision, then you're really not doing the job that you've been asked to do. You've got to resolve this based on the facts presented and the evidence before you. And to the extent that, I think the point's well taken, if you go to that council meeting and you speak on behalf of yourself, but as a member of the preservation board, to what extent are you undermining your work as a group? I think you really need to think about that before you do it. But I don't think there's anything that prohibits it as a member of, a citizen of the town or the city to go and make a presentation or to speak at the public hearing.
We just want to make sure that the council hears both sides of the argument.
Yeah.
We had a case earlier this year where we turned down an ATM in the building that is under construction now, and they appealed to council, and there was staff supplied information, and then much public testimony from people who said we need this ATM, but there was nothing from the Historic Preservation Board that allowed us as a body to explain why we ruled as we did. And there were certainly options in what we had talked about. That's why I think Pam's thing tonight was very important. Right. To make sure that there's a context of why we did what we did tonight. So would that then go through staff? We would make sure that staff presented our side of things?
Well, I think you could do that or do like we did tonight. I mean, I think that when making your findings, you could say these are the things that we considered important, and make that as part of the resolution you send up for them to think about. And then that goes out in the council packet. Okay. That they will get that too. So I think that both of those are good ways to do it. I mean, I thought this was a wonderful teachable moment tonight. When, all right, I'm listening to my fellow members on the group, and how do we, send a message to council and tell them what we're thinking and why this is important and stuff. I mean, I thought that was an excellent way to get your all of your ideas in front of them, and I'm sure they'll take it seriously. I mean, that's a very thoughtful group.
Okay. So, thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I will say from the staff perspective, after having this meeting this evening, we will add a slide into our presentation to council that explains what happened at HPB, as well as a paragraph in our staff report to council of the findings of HPB.
That would be good, because when we did the ATM last time, the only person that talked about HPB's perspective was the applicant. And of course, it was a little, it wasn't exactly the way we were looking at things. And if staff could kind of paraphrase the larger discussion, that would be wonderful.
And then Jen, I would just ask that when you make those amendments, that we get copies so we can upload them in the packet the day after the meeting. Okay. So they're reflected.
Okay.
Excellent point. So, because you're working as a public body, you're subject to the open meetings laws. And this was not in the presentation before, and Ken was like, we got to talk to him about that. Like, okay. So, if there's a quorum, this is the one I know, any kind of gathering of your members can be considered an open meeting under the Open Meetings Act. So you got to be careful about what you do, okay? So a meeting would be any discussion of the stuff that comes before you, right? the regulation, the policy, anything that would require your formal action, you misspell a quorum in this side. So a quorum of the members or 3 or more of you at the same place at the same time, whichever is fewer under the statute, if you're discussing a formal action, could constitute a public meeting and should have a notice, should have 24 hours advance notice. So, 3 of you run into each other at the grocery store and start chatting about something, we should have noticed that. No, just kidding. Don't talk about something that comes before you just because of that requirement. Now, sometimes, there's some remodel of a historic event. You guys all want to go and see it because this is what you do, right? It's a social gathering, and it may have been something that was before you. Sometimes staff will even put that in the notice, that there is a special event that members of the historic board will be at, and make that a notice. So if somebody wants to come and watch to make sure you guys aren't discussing about something, they can come, and spy on you. All right. But generally, that's okay, social events, but don't talk about company business at the social events, right? So merely discussing matters of public importance is not necessarily a meeting. So you might have some really important discussions out in the hall about, will the Broncos be better with Flacco this year, right? That's not within your purview. It may be a matter of public importance, but it's probably not a meeting when the 3 or 4 of you are talking about it, right? 3 or 4 of you talking about, the fire at the Notre Dame Cathedral today. Not going to come before you. It might be historic preservation, but it's not a meeting. You with me?
I have a question about that. Now, this specifically stated it was matters that could come before us. If we were to talk about historic preservation in general, if we were to talk about trends or what I learned at a conference or things like that, or specifically to Notre Dame, they said that they are going to rebuild it. So can we do it with steel and drywall, or do we have to, does it have to? And those things are not germane to specific Littleton issues or a matter that comes before us. They are more historic preservation in general. Is that permissible to talk about?
Yeah, and I think you raise a really good point. I don't think these are, there's not a binary choice that some stuff will always be before you and some stuff will never be. It's on a sliding scale. So, your choice about, talking about, historic preservation as to what they're going to do with the cathedral in Paris, I don't think you have to worry about that. Now, if you've been to a conference and you want to talk about trends, that may be something that you want to bring up in the public comment or the member comment section of the meeting. And then you say, I was at a conference and these seem to be the trends, or I was reading an article, and then you bring that up to everybody. Right? And so that might be a way to do that in the public setting and then never get an allegation that you were somehow having a public meeting without following the rules. Okay? So I think, and I think you got to use your best judgment, but, when in doubt, I think you could do that at the end of the meeting, and, if you have something to bring up, that would be wonderful. Usually got to have 24 hours notice, and the city's got all sorts of places they publish this stuff online and various spots around the building and all that stuff. That's what Colleen does, okay? If it's a public meeting, you got to have minutes, and all of that subject to open records rules, all of that stuff. And if you take a formal action, there's got to be a vote. Okay? This almost never happens, but if you make a decision and you're not at a public meeting and somebody sues over it, it can be reversed. And we get to pay them for the privilege of going and getting it reversed. So let's try to avoid that. I don't want to be fighting that fight because I hate losing, really. I do. Okay. This is this thing that's been sort of the brave new world of open meetings law. Because social media, if you got a text message that's, you're as a group and you text to the whole group, it's probably a meeting. I would not do that, right? Staff is very good about when they send out your notices and your packets, they send it out as a blind copy. So even if you reply all, you're not replying to all. Okay? But, don't reply all. If you've got a question about, I can't get the attachments to open, just tell that to staff, right? And then you're not having a meeting. So it's things like that has become a real problem for city attorneys. It's like the technology is getting ahead of the statute. So I just would be careful about that. Particularly, you might be on the, a social group where you text with somebody and it could just create a problem. So just think about it before you do it. That's all I can do. The other thing I would be cautious about is, since you are making recommendations to council, these might be your friends, you might run into them in the grocery store, right? But you probably shouldn't be talking about stuff that you know is on the way, right? Because members of council should get the same evidence when they're making a decision, just like you should. So, other than saying, procedurally we did that last night, you're going to be seeing it on your docket in a couple of weeks, you probably shouldn't talk about the details. Right? Because you don't want to be contaminating the other board, or the same with the planning commission. If you've made a recommendation to them, you probably shouldn't be talking to those members out of school and putting them in a position where they're having a problem. Okay? I don't know what our rules say about this. Can somebody call into the meetings here?
No.
They have to be present, or okay.
In very rare instances, we have allowed Skype testimony in regards to like liquor licensing because they were out of state. But there was actually a motion made to allow that before we were able to do that.
They've changed the Colorado statutes on corporate proceedings and now a lot of that. But because of the open meetings requirements, it's very difficult to do that. Yeah, so if you're going to have a meeting where you take a vote electronically or something like that, I would really recommend against it, but sometimes that can happen. But we got to keep meetings, we got to have staff in the loop and all of that stuff. So it can happen, but let's just try not to. And if it happens, let's make sure one of us gets in the loop that has ESQ next to their name, and we don't get us in any troubles. Okay. So that was all I really had. I just wanted to kind of cover some of these high points and see if you had any questions. You guys have been asking great questions, by the way. Anything else?
I have a question. Sure. Tonight, the matter in front of us concerned the easement and basically vacating that easement. And we had discussion specifically about the pergolas, the design of the pergolas, the material of the pergolas, and all kinds of things. Was that appropriate or not?
Oh, if I was going to be a stickler, I would have probably, put a little shorter leash on everybody, but why? These people wanted to feel heard, the public wanted to feel heard, everybody wanted to feel like things were, everybody had a chance to air their side of the story. You're right. The question was, are you going to recommend to council that they do something contrary to the easement language? That was really the only question that was before you. But all the stuff came to you from staff. All the stuff was there. It seems to me that, it's there. You might as well ask your questions and make sure that you're getting a good decision based on all the information that's before you. I don't know why you would limit yourselves. Now, if you started getting off on other topics, well, what about the building down the block or stuff like that, I probably would have said, that's really not before you tonight. You should probably stick to the issues at hand. Right. You guys all good? Feel way smarter than you did when you walked in the room? Good. I don't know if you had any other business.
I think that's it. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. This is my number, so as long as we're interim city attorneys, you give me a call.
Can we email you, or will we wind up in doing hard
I'm gonna step in, because if I don't, I'll hear from Becky tomorrow. Any communication with the attorney's office really should go through Becky Fye, who is the executive assistant to the city manager and the city attorney.
Because they're trying to control the fees. It just makes sense.
And you may, several of you may have similar questions, and what Becky will do is take those and take a look at it and see if it really is a question for the attorneys, or it might be a question for staff, right? And so Becky will kind of wrangle those, and it is not in any way trying to keep you from having access, but we're trying to funnel everything in a reasonable way, because contrary to what people might think, Paul and Ken and Brandon and Jordan are not sitting patiently by their phones waiting for something from Littleton. Like, you know.
That is not happening. Usually somebody calls and I'm like, not again. No,
exactly. So yes, while you absolutely should use them as a resource, just please make sure it goes through the executive assistant's office and the city manager and city attorney's office.
That is the rules right now.
And we will probably have this situation for at least another 4 months. Most likely as we go through that search, we just open up that search.
Yeah, they've got to search and get applicants and do interviews.
It's a process.
Yeah, it's a whole process. We'll see what
Would
happens.
that be true even when a city attorney is hired? Would you go through Becky as well?
At least initially, and then the city attorney would set their own standards. But at that point, the city attorney is on our payroll, so they're not charging, you know, in billable hours and 6-minute increments. So
My outrageous hourly rate.
yeah, so that's a little bit different situation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Aren't you by the 6 minutes?
I charge by tenths of the hour, yes. Call it the 6-minute marathon. How many little 6-minute things can I get added together to make my hours? Right? It's a pleasure working with you guys.
Thank you.
I'll be back in the next few months to see you.
And Mike,
Touch this going.
Mike, I have one more thing.
Sure, go ahead.
I haven't met some of you, so I'm Jennifer Henninger, the Director of Community Development. So I just wanted to thank you all for volunteering your time and being a part of the community and serving the community in this way. So thank you very much, and I think you all have my contact information, so feel free to reach out anytime.
Well, that's our last order of business. I think we'll quickly go around the room since the time is late, and if you'd introduce yourselves, and then we'll introduce ourselves, and then we'll get to know each other a little bit better.
Awesome. Well, I'm Poppy Gillett. I'm a Golden native. I'm sorry, it's not Littleton. I moved down here in June. Before that, I've been in Fort Collins and spent some time with my family in Golden. I've got a master's in history, technically, with a focus in cultural resource management, but I often say historic preservation because I think that rings a little truer for a lot of people. And I'm an architectural historian for an engineering firm.
Why did you want to be on historic preservation?
So I live over kind of by Bemis Library, and I love mid-century modern. And I noticed you guys came out with a survey last year in 2018 on mid-century modern resources, and I read it and I thought, oh, I want to be involved with it. So great job on your survey. It turned out wonderful. And I got really inspired. I thought there's really room for growth here. So
wonderful.
Wanted to be part of that.
Well, we got a project for
She didn't even know she was volunteering.
Yeah.
Lisa.
I'm Lisa Hood. I've lived in Littleton for about 2 years, but I'm a Denver native. I have a master's in urban planning with a specialization in historic preservation. After I finished my master's, I got a job in Minneapolis, so I was a senior city planner there, and I was actually doing all their historic preservation commission projects, and then also taking a bunch of projects to the planning commission, so I was kind of on the other side of the dais for a few years. Then I decided to move back to Colorado because Minnesota is really cold. I think that's all here. And I worked for about 1.5 years at a consulting firm doing zoning code updates and preservation ordinance work. So I worked on the most recent updates to Fort Collins Preservation Code, just as an example. And then in September, I transitioned to Denver Regional Council of Governments, DRCOG, and I'm not doing anything related to preservation at all. I'm a public engagement specialist there, so I get people involved in the work that DRCOG is doing. So I really wanted, I have been at probably hundreds of board and commission meetings in the last 5 years, so I've kind of always known that I wanted to be on the other side of the dais eventually, and with this new job, not really getting to do preservation work, I really wanted to still have that in my life, so that's why I wanted to join the board.
Welcome. That's great. Andy?
So I'm Andy Hill, and I have lived in Littleton for about 17 years, and I love it, and I'm work for the State Department of Local Affairs.
Well, I'm Kim Field. I have lived here since 1995. And I am a historian and a writer and author. And gosh, I'm really into mid-century modern too, and working on the West Littleton corridor.
Let's have not a meeting, Kim.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're doing some pretty cool stuff. And it's that's a neat place in Littleton and also in the broader community. So welcome.
Mike Price, I've been on the board for 5 years, and I'm a 29-year resident of Littleton. Did historic preservation in Denver and did a lot of restorations back in the 1970s and 80s of old Victorian homes. And I've always found it as a passion for me. I've been in development and real estate for most of my career and retired now, but happy to be your chairperson. So glad we're all working together, and we had a great meeting tonight. Thank you.
My name is Pam Grove, and I've been on Historic Preservation Board for 8 years, Historical Preservation Board for 8 years. I'm just interested in history. Long ago and far away, I was a history major in college. Went into business, and about 1.5 years ago, I joined the ranks of people that get to do what they want every day. So I get to spend more time on doing work for HP.
David Spratland. I'm a Colorado native, lived most of my life here in Littleton. Architect for a small design build firm here in Littleton as well. And I really wanted to be part of the Historic Preservation Board because I didn't really have a whole lot of connection to the downtown area until I moved back from college and found out how great it really was, even though I lived in Littleton most of my life. And starting a family and seeing what opportunities were there, I really wanted to be more involved and make sure it's continues on for generations to come.
I'm Laura Gabriel. We've lived in Littleton 19 years. I'm an antique dealer and a designer. And years ago, we lived in what is now called the Highlands. And I sat on the Historic Preservation Board in Highlands and Potter Highlands at that time. So I love history and really wanted to make sure that Littleton maintained the character that it had. That's me.
I'm Amy Fisher. I'm as close to a Littleton native as you get, born in Denver, but I grew up here in Littleton. Although I've lived around other places, including the Twin Cities. I went to college in St. Paul, where it is very cold. I have a master's degree in library studies with an emphasis in archives and records management. So I've worked most of my career as a professional historian and archivist for companies, Procter & Gamble, Western Union, et cetera. And most recently, I worked for Douglas County Libraries as a branch manager, not working in history. So like you, I wanted to keep something historical in my life. And I am completely and utterly committed to Littleton and seeing the city do well. So that's why I'm here.
Jennifer?
I lived in the Twin Cities too when I was younger, and it is cold, yes. But it's pretty good. So, yes, I'm the new community development director. I have a undergraduate degree in planning from Cornell University and a master's in public administration. And I have been in the planning field for over 20 years. Working for the city of Lakewood. I actually started at DRCOG, and then for the past 10 years in two different private planning and engineering firms. So,
well, we're glad you're here.
I'm glad to be here.
Anna?
I want to announce something that we're going to have on May 9th is our Historical Preservation Awards. And Laura and I have been working on the committee with HLI, Historic Littleton. And it would be lovely if we could get as many of you to come as your schedules will allow. It's May 9th. It's a Thursday night, 6:30 starts refreshments, there's punch and cookies. 7 o'clock starts the formal program. We'll go ahead and make the awards. And then there's actually going to be some entertainment, the CD side of Denver, this group that does a little bit of improv kind of thing, like skits. And you'll get an invitation, but to put it on your calendar now, and it will be over at 8:30, like we have to be out the door. So maximum of, if you come just for the formal part, an hour and a half, and if you come for refreshments, a little bit longer. So hopefully everybody would come. I don't know, do you have anything to add?
The awards are very interesting this year, very much Littleton oriented, and I think it would be very interesting if y'all were to come. I think I've learned a lot learning about the awards we're giving and who we're giving them to. Learned a ton.
And it'd just be nice if we had a good showing. And one of our properties is on Littleton Court.
Yes.
And where is the awards being held?
The Littleton Historical Museum.
Okay.
And you get
across the street from my house, great.
Yes, you'll get an invite, but I just wanted people to put it on their agenda.
Good idea, Cam, thank you.
It's good.
And last thing is, in your inbox, in your city inbox, there's a action alert comment on proposed rule changes to the National Register of Historic Places nomination. So if you could take a chance to open that email and read it, I think it's very important. If you have any comments, I think they're due by April 30th, but they're talking about some fairly major changes, especially in public buildings that are subject to the historic preservation. So that's all I have. Anybody else?
Is that the property owner has to provide consent for listing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's the one. Anybody else? Well, thank you. Good meeting tonight. Sorry.
Thank you. Great to meet you. And thank you so
wonderful to have
much for just like bringing it and contributing so much.
Nice to meet all of you. Thank you.
Yeah. Like the first year I was on this board, I don't think I said a word.
I know I didn't.